Hi everyone, Editor Sam here with the Cold Open. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on Pope Francis, the protest leader. So if you haven't already, go back and listen to part 1, where you can learn about Pope Francis's life in Argentina and his rise to become the Bishop of Rome. Now if you have heard that one, please sit back and enjoy part 2 of the life of Pope Francis. Adam, Pope Francis clearly wanted to make protest a key aspect of his papacy, but he was at the top of the system he was in.
Yeah.
And in a way, protesting against that system. In this way, his words sometimes seemed hollow when people under him would sabotage his messages and not follow through. We can bring examples from our own causes like climate change and leftist influence on politics largely. We often see climate pledges from governments with no action, and we see reformers trying to change structures like the US Congress or the British Parliament from within, but they usually fail. So what do we do when institutions absorb our language but reject our goals?
Oh, man.
Can protest from within ever be revolutionary, or does the system always win that game?
It certainly can be revolutionary, but the system may still win the game. I think in the instance of Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, the question that this raises for me is the degree to which an individual pope has the power to change the Catholic Church. This is an ancient institution, and although it is symbolically concentrated on this one figure, the Pope, or I suppose more accurately, God, and then the Pope as his earthly vessel, the degree to which that individual has the power to change this behemoth of an apparatus is in question. You certainly can change things from within. What comes to mind is the Meiji Restoration in Japan, when Japan was this sort of still feudal state that was forcibly opened by American moneyed interests in the latter part of the 19th century.
Yeah, famously by Matthew Perry, but not of Friends fame.
Yes, Matthew Perry of Commodore fame, not Friends fame. Japan became a modern imperial power very quickly after that. They sent delegations all over Europe and to emulate those aspects of state, and that was certainly revolutionary in a sense, not necessarily in a good way, but It did really change things, industrialized rapidly. So it can happen, but that was still, I suppose the revolution in part came from American warships blasting open the country's political system, but the actual changes which resulted in a
empire,
came from Japanese officials. So, is it possible? Sure. Is it easy, especially if it's just one individual? I don't know the support that Francis had or the ability the Pope has to sort of pack the courts, as it were, but I imagine it's not easy.
Yeah, good point. And we'll get to him packing the courts in a bit. But I think his papacy was full of small rebellions that made the Vatican uneasy and emboldened movements on the margins. Some of the most powerful things he did weren't the encyclicals or speeches, but in quiet and unexpected actions that pushed against the decorum and the detachment of church traditions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a widely believed legend, though never confirmed officially, that Francis would sneak out of the Vatican at night in the early years, disguised as an ordinary priest to bring food to the people sleeping rough in Rome.
Oh, wow.
There are many accounts from unhoused individuals in Rome that have sworn this was the case, though no one ever confirmed or denied it at the Vatican. And whether true or not, the story caught fire because it felt plausible, the kind of thing that Pope Francis might do.
Mm-hmm.
What is confirmed is that under his leadership, the Vatican set up showers, bathrooms, barbers for the homeless, and Francis personally invited unhoused people to St. Peter's Basilica for dinner, sitting down and eating with them himself many times. He also broke protocol abroad. On his visit to Cuba in 2015, he met with Fidel and Raul Castro and publicly praised Cuba's investment in universal healthcare and education, which, we also stand as
Yeah.
And this move enraged U.S. conservatives, obviously. Wildly enough, after this visit, Raul Castro said he started going to church again.
Wow, okay.
Not saying he had converted back to the Catholic faith, but he said, Francis has made me much more of a man willing to go to church.
Wow.
But yeah, he was similarly outspoken when visiting the U.S. that same year, delivering a speech to Congress where he condemned the arms trade, the death penalty, and what he called, quote, the new tyranny of unfettered capitalism. So no surprise the conservatives labeled him a Marxist when, his visit to Cuba was very cordial and his visit to the U.S. was very confrontational. But throughout his papacy, Francis consistently aligned himself with the poor and working class people, not abstractly but directly. He convened global popular movements, summits, welcomed trash collectors and indigenous leaders into the Vatican halls, and he did this much more frequently than he did official delegations from governments around the world. And he once spoke to day laborers and farm workers on the outskirts of Rome, urging them to not lose hope and reminding them that their dignity did not depend on market value. In 2020, after meeting with climate activists and land rights groups, he declared that economic exploitation and environmental destruction were part of the same moral crisis, which is also the same conclusion Greta Thunberg had found.
Yeah. Did they ever meet? I feel like they...
Maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, they met in 2019 at the Vatican. Francis encouraged her to continue her activism, telling her, continue, and go on, go ahead.
Look at that. Our episodes collide in a big way. That's cool. I have a quote for you said by Francis in Message for the World, Day of the Poor, 2018.
In today's world, many forms of injustice persist, fed by profit-seeking and by a throwaway culture that fails to respect human dignity. This is not the world God wants. Wow.
So from all these quotes, you can see he's knocking on that door of trying to get to people that capitalism, climate change, all of this is hand in hand, that it is all immoral, because from his pulpit, he's one of the few people on earth that has that sway over some groups of people where he can say this is an immoral action. These were not just pastoral sentiments, they were political, and they framed inequality as a spiritual failure of the global order. By affirming the struggles of people cast aside by capitalism and empire, Francis positioned the church, however imperfectly, as a potential ally in the fight for dignity and survival worldwide. Now, I have a question for you. I have several questions for you, Adam. When we think about protests, it's easy to focus on mass movements and street actions, but Francis seems to have practiced a kind of relational rebellion, one rooted in care, proximity, and symbolic acts. Do you think that kind of protest is politically effective, or is it too easily absorbed by the institution it's meant to challenge?
What I will say is that I used to be, when I lived in Oxford, a part of an organisation called Oxford Mutual Aid that sought out to mostly provide food parcels, no questions asked. They did other things as well. And recently there was a big debate, I heard this through the grapevine, about whether or not they should become a charity legally, and they resisted it for a long time because there are certain legal obligations that come with charities. There are certain ideological underpinnings that go with being a charity instead of being a mutual aid organisation, but you have access to a lot more funding and a lot more stability, so you can help people out more in those ways. And to me, the legal structure is not as important as helping people and getting them the food and support that they need. But if you do want to maintain that ethos, it has to come with a certain political push, a certain political education, perhaps, that goes along with these things. Now, the tricky thing about care as an act of resistance is that it is very hard to bring people along with that political message as well. It's very hard. People just need food to eat and they're worried about keeping the lights on in their home. It's hard to bring them into the fold of a political movement.
It also comes across very transactionally, right? Like, you don't want to come across this transactionally. Like, hey, here's this food, here's this aid. Now come vote for us or come support us in this protest. You just want to do good. And if people are influenced it later on, I feel like that type of influence will come with the kids of those people one day, right? Like 15 years later, they see this group and they're like, oh, they helped me when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, and also that you have to sort of, once you provide that aid, that support, anything additional that is movement building, you need to sort of place for people to take if they want, right? Like you host events that, people are welcome to come to, or just have on display affiliations without pushing it, which is a tricky line to walk, but doable, I suppose. And given that these practices of care are so necessary and increasingly more necessary to support people through a sort of neoliberal poverty, then I think maybe that's the direction that people have to take, is putting on these events for people to participate in.
Ironically, that's the playbook of missionary work as well. When I was involved with like Catholic youth ministry, that was always the key message to us organizers was like, don't be pushy, Just be, accommodating and welcoming. And like, if these teenagers feel safe and accepted and all that, then they'll be more likely to come back rather than if you just force feed them doctrine and everything like that. I guess it works. Because in a sense, like, if a church is doing that job correctly, it is a form of mutual aid. There's just so many churches that don't do that correctly.
Yeah.
And there's so much more I could say about examples of how Pope Francis changed the church and its messaging over the years. But I'll leave it at what we talked about because I feel like those are sort of the big ones that, they don't get too specific, but they kind of encapsulate his messaging as a whole. And Adam, I don't know if you heard the news, but he died in April 2025.
Yeah, J.D. Vance murdered him.
Yeah,
allegedly.
He did. Yeah, allegedly. And we'll get to J.D. Vance in a second.
Okay.
And we have a new pope, Robert Prevost, Pope Bob from Chicago.
Pope Bob, yep.
AKA Pope Leo the 14th. What do you know about the new Pope Leo?
Largely what I know from talking to you, I know that he is from Chicago, but that he was not a priest in the American Catholic Church. He lived much of his life in Peru, was it?
Yeah.
And was a priest in the Peruvian church. And I remember reading couple of articles about him when the conclave happened. And apparently he was very well regarded by the local population. In a similar vein to Francis, there was reading an account of a village where there had been a flood, and he shows up with some aid, some food, and the local people were saying, yeah, we expected him to do what priests usually do, which is drop off some food, take a photograph and leave, but he stuck his Wellington boots on and just started digging out the road and really got stuck in and involved with everything there and seemed to really care about it. So in that way, it seems he is, or at least previously has been continuing this sort of Franciscan legacy.
Yeah.
But I guess whether that remains, we shall see.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example there that I've read about as well, and it's always good to hear that he was living his ministry before he ever thought about the possibility of being pope. Like you said, he's an American, but spent most of his professional life in Peru, where he was acting bishop of Chiclayo, which I say acting bishop because it's too small to actually be a diocese.
Okay.
It's in this remote part of northwest Peru. Relatively remote in Peru, certainly remote on a global stage. Mm-hmm. But he was also made the titular bishop of Sufar by Pope Francis, which basically allowed him to be a cardinal.
Okay.
So he said, okay, you're not a bishop in Peru because it's too small. We'll give you this title, which popes sometimes do, where they dig up a title that used to exist 1,500 years ago.
So where is Sufar?
It was a Roman province in modern Algeria.
Okay. That's interesting.
I don't know if he's ever been there, but he was the titular bishop of there.
Huh.
Point number 2, he is a White Sox fan, so he knows a lot about suffering.
Okay.
Point number 3, he has beef with J.D. Vance, even before he killed Pope Francis, allegedly.
What is his beef with J.D. Vance, other than that Vance is a disgusting human being?
Yeah, I mean, all people with a conscience should have some beef with that guy. But it's funny because he's Pope now, and he faces the same challenges we all face when we're getting a job these days, which is that social media has existed for a while. And he had a Twitter for a while as Robert Prevost. And this actually wasn't too long ago. This was February. J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, which, might I say, no offense to anyone listening who is a Catholic convert, they're the most annoying people you will meet in the Catholic Church because they feel they know all the doctrine and they're correct about everything, and they, they're like J.D. Vance about everything, But,
okay.
So J.D. Vance stated in an interview with Fox News that it was a Christian tenet to, quote, love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens, and then after that, prioritize the rest of the world. To which the then Robert Prevost responded with, quote, J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others.
Okay, wow.
Which, it was like a reply to that interview. So he was scrolling, he saw this interview, he's like, this guy really grinds my gears. You know what? I'm replying to this.
It's the timeline that we live in where a man who would be Pope atted a man who would be the vice president is a crazy timeline.
Yeah. Well, he already was vice president because it was just this February. But
yeah.
I
see. Yeah.
Crazy timeline indeed. Now, on to why I think he was chosen at this point in time, which I think I've mentioned to you as well. I do think if Kamala Harris had won the U.S. presidency, that we would have a different pope right now.
Yeah.
Which is also a very weird thing to think about.
Yeah.
I think, one, Pope Francis stacked the deck with his long papacy. I think 60% of the cardinals were chosen by him. Most of them are progressives. And though Francis was very humble in his outward appearance, I think internally in the Vatican he was very savvy. He wanted to set up these roadblocks for any future conservatives to undo what he had done. And he made alliances with a lot of progressive people around the world to ensure, hopefully, that progressive would be chosen. Obviously, there's no guarantee with how the conclave works. But I think also, because, again, don't bet on who the pundits are saying will win, because Robert Prevost was not in the top 5, top 10 of who people thought would get the papacy this go around. I think he was chosen to stand in contrast to American hegemony. Which is weird because he's American.
Yeah.
But I think he was a perfect choice for this because he's American. And he's now the Pope. He's the first American Pope ever, which people thought could never happen.
It does feel weird having an American Pope. That's
Yeah, it does. It really does. But I think you saw it with him stepping onto that balcony for the first time. He spoke in Italian, he spoke in Latin, and he spoke in Spanish. And he thanked the people of Peru. He didn't mention the Americans once, despite being American.
Yeah. Not speaking English was a powerful move.
Yeah. So I think he stands as a crossroads for American Catholics, American conservative Catholics, of who is the authority, who is the moral authority in your life. Is it Donald Trump or is it the Pope? And we've already had a lot of people say it's Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah. Wow. That is a weird choice. He might actually be the Antichrist. It's
Maybe.
If you read descriptions, they're not far off.
And why I think he chose his name as well, Leo the 14th. Leo the 13th, he was Pope from 1876 to 1903, and he was Pope during a time of immense change in technology and for the workforce. He was known as the Pope for the workers, and this was kind of before any Marxist states had formed, before any Marxist revolutions, but I think he definitely lived by Marxist tenets without necessarily being even self-labeling as one. Our modern Pope Leo cites today as a time of similarly immense change and a threat to workers' rights and livelihood. And he cites AI as the biggest threat to human dignity in the world. And he's also piggybacked on Pope Francis's care for the climate as well. I think he wants to be a pope for the workers, which I think is a good sign for us and our ideology as well.
Is he a progressive?
We'll see.
Okay.
On a papal scale, I think definitely.
Okay.
On a earthly political scale, probably not, but maybe not as radical as Francis, but definitely not a conservative.
Sure.
I mean, he was registered as a Republican last he lived in the States, but that was like in the 80s. So who knows? Also weird that a pope was part of an American political party at any point. But we can only hope that Leo will be a continuation of Francis's legacy. He's still in his 60s, so the choice of him being elected now means he could be around for a very long time. And he might be playing the slow game on the change he wants to implement. He did move back into the papal palace. He did start to wear some of the more extravagant outfits, but from his interviews, it's more of a compromise in tradition rather than rejecting what Francis said about it.
It also seems like he is not as adorned as Benedict the 16th, for example.
No, or even John Paul II. He's kind of an in-between. Like I think he was a choice made by a lot of the conclave. He was elected very early on as well. It only took like 3 or 4 ballots. So a lot of people wanted him, the Pope. But yeah, we can only hope that he continues Francis's legacy. And Adam, as a person completely outside of the Catholic sphere of influence, do you see a value in a Pope being relatively progressive? Does it matter at all in the wider scope of revolution or combating the rise of fascism today?
Well, first I'll push back that I'm outside of the Catholic sphere of influence. I think pretty much the entire world is part of the Catholic sphere of influence.
Except China.
Well, maybe. maybe.
Xi Jinping outlived Francis. Let's just say that.
He did. They started their tenure on the same day, and one of them's still around. So he started younger, though. But...
And had an extra lung.
and had an extra lung. We assume. I can't speak for how many lungs Xi Jinping has. I do think there's value to it. I mean, if nothing else, the Vatican is a state. It has a seat at the United Nations, right? People often forget this about the church, but the Pope is not only a priest, he is effectively a king and has a lot of power there to influence that. And not only do they have the political and material power that comes with being a state. You know, the Vatican is a small state, the smallest state, but owns a lot of wealth. I don't think anyone knows exactly how much. I remember trying to look it up a while ago and seeing wildly varying figures for the amount available to the Catholic Church in their coffers. But it's certainly in the billions, and there's only a few hundred people with Vatican citizenship, as it were. Mm-hmm. So they've got a fair chunk of change. And I think that the Catholic Church is not the historical force that it once was, right? They're not ruling over vast swathes of Europe directly, and there aren't family dynasties poisoning each other in order to attain the sort of papal throne. But nevertheless, anymore. See
the Borgias from last time.
Yeah. But nevertheless, there are, I mean, at least 1 billion people who look to the Pope for spiritual leadership, and that Pope, by virtue of being such an important spiritual leader and the head of state, has access to remarkably powerful people throughout the world. For example, Fidel and Raul Castro, American Congress. The Pope can push a message to lots of people. Now, people might resent that, and the Catholic Church pushing their message on people has not always been a popular move historically, but because that did happen historically, they have an influence on the world. And given that you have that influence, you might as well use it for something positive. Whether it will result in lasting change, I think, is another question. And perhaps there is more to be done in order to facilitate that change. But it is certainly better than not advocating for these things.
And I think there's a domino effect in society, right? For example, a priest with progressive views under Benedict would be walking on eggshells. Right. And a priest under Francis would feel a lot more free to express those views from the pulpit, whether that's in, New Zealand or Belgium, or there's a Catholic church in every country in the world, even North Korea.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. They are there. They're not out in the open, but the Vatican has confirmed there are Catholics there that they're in contact with. Yeah, I think then when you have that domino effect all the way down to the priests, all the way down to the people they're talking to every day, how many priests around the world were impacted in a huge way by Francis's views? How many members of just the church-going population were also impacted? I think it is a domino effect that maybe we haven't seen the end of yet, and maybe it's a progressive push that will continue to grow over time that started back in 2013. But we'll see.
We'll see. Hopefully so. I think your point about if Kamala Harris had won the election, we would have a different pope is very interesting. The return of the resurrection of Donald Trump as a political figure forced them to pick a side effectively, right? And this is what we say about everything being political, Mm-hmm. It is not a neutral choice who becomes pope. And there were some commentators trying to say stop making the pope political, which is funny because he is the head of a country.
Yeah.
But the fact that the events of a different country could have such a strong impact on it, because I agree, I think that played a big role. Fascinating stuff, and what Leo then does with that. Yeah, well, I wish him the best, and hope he continues on a progressive platform.
We can only hope that JD Vance doesn't visit too often. It's bad for one's health, allegedly.
Allegedly.
Yeah, allegedly.
I have to say that or I won't be allowed into the States.
You're not allowed back. A guy from Norway got denied entry for the bald, weird JD Vance meme on his camera roll.
Ironically, that meant that meme was shared on every news site in Europe. So it's
Streisand effect. I mean,
yes, yeah, exactly.
I was listening back to some of our preseason episodes recently, and Trump had not yet been elected. And we're solidly, half a year in at this point, and it's much worse than we ever could have predicted.
Yeah, it's bad.
Just bad. If any of the listeners wanted an update, they know.
They know. They're here too.
But yeah, let's close it out, Adam. Let me give this conclusion about Francis here. So Pope Francis passed away on April 21st, 2025, on Easter Monday, having spent his final public appearance just the day before calling from the Vatican for a ceasefire in Gaza. Even in his last days, he remained deeply committed to justice and compassion. Throughout his papacy, he consistently prioritized migrants and refugees, visiting the island of Lampedusa, that's the one I was mentioning earlier, urging nations to welcome those in transit, and even organizing the participation of migrant refugees and rescue crews in his funeral mass at St. Peter's. And when the time came for his burial, he chose the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome's Esquilino neighborhood, a modest quarter historically home to migrants, the poor, and the disenfranchised. His tomb was simple, marked only Franciscus, and his final wishes included being accompanied by homeless people, migrants, prisoners, and transgender women during his burial, a reflection of the church he championed, one rooted in solidarity with the marginalized. Francis never claimed to be a revolutionary in the conventional sense. He didn't dismantle the structures, but he upended expectations of what a pope could be. He lived amongst the poor, championed migrants in life and death, and pressed the church to share both its wealth and its spiritual authority with the oppressed. Francis didn't tear down the church, but he left no doubt about whose side it should be on. His legacy compels us to ask, how do we honor that disruption? And when reform feels too slow, what do our movements need to push further? What do you think, Adam?
Those people accompanying him at his burial, the sort of, to take a biblical turn, the wretched of the earth, right? People who are in a more marginalized position is a powerful move, and his advocacy for Gaza and the environment, all very powerful. Yes, there are things that he could have done better. I think that people often refer to that maybe he didn't act enough on like child sexual abuse cases in the Catholic Church, in an endemic problem, things of that nature. That is the main one that comes up. And the Catholic Church is a behemoth that's going to be slow to change. But I think that in Francis, there is an individual who seems, at least, to have really embodied the values that he speaks for. And I think that there is something powerful and inspirational in that. You asked about what to do when it feels that change is too slow coming. And yeah, it does feel like it's too slow coming. Bad things happen very quickly and good things take a long time. And it's easier to knock down a building than it is to build one. But I think that, what's the quote? Action is the antidote to despair, right? You need to act as you can and where you can, and find your community and people who will act with you, I think is very important. Maybe that's a sort of liberatory theology. Wouldn't be my choice for sure, but if you can follow Francis's example, I think he's a fine example to follow. He always seemed to care for the poor and downtrodden, as I suppose you are hoping to see in the Bishop of Rome.
We'd grown accustomed to not expecting that.
That's true. Yeah, we had. It's not something you see often from a politician. The only other one that comes to mind is, I believe it was the president of Uruguay, who famously donated all of his paycheck to charity and drove like a 30-year-old car and had secondhand suits and stuff.
I hadn't heard of that. Yeah,
we'll talk about him at a later point. But the point is that these are rare individuals.
Right, and I think one of the most important things I've taken away from Pope Francis in hearing all the stories after he's passed and what people are reflecting on is that in moments of despair, we can still do some small things that help in immense ways. There's one anecdote that I haven't written down, but stuck with me. And that is that there's one Catholic church in Gaza, and every night since October 7th, he would call the pastor there, the priest there. And he wouldn't just talk to them. He spoke to members throughout the communities in Gaza as well via that priest. Say, oh, bring this community over or bring these people over and I'll talk to them as well. He called them every night when the bombs were falling, when he was able to, in terms of when the communication was available, just to let them know that they weren't alone. And he didn't have to do that at all. He could have had a delegate calling them every night, especially when he was in bad health. But that was his biggest priority, especially when he was in the hospital as well. He was always calling for people to bring him the satellite phone. He needs to talk to that church in Gaza. And he never gave up on them. So even when times feel dark and it doesn't seem like there's much we can do, I think we still should reach for those little things that we can do to help others.
Yeah, you do what you can.
Yeah.
I think that's a lovely place to leave it.
With that, Thank you for listening today. If you enjoy our episodes and you know other people that would also enjoy them, please send them to those people. As with most movements that are not backed by any large donors, word of mouth is how we will grow. Dear listeners, stay safe out there and keep fighting the good fight. Adam, can you leave us with this quote from Pope Francis from a speech he gave in Santa Cruz, Bolivia on July 9th, 2015?
Let us not be afraid to say it. We want change, real change, structural change. The system is by now intolerable. Farm workers without land, families without homes, labourers without rights. That is the economy that kills. That is the economy that excludes. That is the economy that destroys Mother Earth. So, Jose Mujica was the 40th president of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015. He was a former guerrilla with Tupamaros and was tortured and imprisoned for 14 years during the military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s in Uruguay. He was a member of the Broad Front coalition of left-wing parties, Minister of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries from 2005-2008, and a senator afterwards. He won the presidential election in 2009 and implemented a range of progressive policies, including the decriminalization of abortion, the legalization of marijuana consumption, and the legalization of same-sex marriage. He also strengthened the country's trade unions and significantly bolstered minimum wage. While he was in office, he was described as being the world's poorest president, as he lived an austere life, and he donated 90% of his $12,000 monthly salary to charities that supported low-income individuals and small entrepreneurs. He was an outspoken critic of capitalism for focusing on material consumption, which does not contribute to human happiness. He died on the 13th of May, this year, aged 89.
What a legend.
What a legend. Rest in peace, Jose Mujica.